In the sleepy hills of Fern Hollow, one man's quiet cabin life ignites a war with a clipboard-wielding tyrant named Karen, where deeds clash with delusions, and revenge blooms from the roots of an old exemption. The morning I received a lawsuit from someone named Karen was the same morning she marched into my yard in a leopard print sun hat armed with a clipboard, 2 backup lawn chairs, and a man who introduced himself as the neighborhood aesthetic compliance observer. I was holding a cup of coffee and feeding a raccoon-eyed half-domesticated creature when she waved the envelope in my face and said, "Since you won't pay your dues, we're taking you to court." I laughed, thinking it was some HOA prank until I looked at the paperwork and realized they'd actually filed a real legal case. The funny part, I never joined their HOA, never signed a thing, and had paperwork older than Karen's son had to prove it. But she wasn't just confident, she acted like she was queen of the hillside, and I was the peasant who dared defy tribute. What she didn't know, what would later make a judge burst out laughing, was that the land her precious HOA was built on had a secret, one that started with a dusty deed I'd inherited, and ended with me owning a whole lot more than my front porch. It all started when I bought the cabin at the edge of Fern Hollow, a hilly lakeside community where retirees came to pretend they were living in Tuscany, and HOA fees funded everything from sidewalk poetry contests to official mailbox paint color inspections. I'd inherited the place from my Uncle Bob, a rugged Vietnam vet with a chainsaw collection and a profound dislike for bureaucracy. He'd bought the land before the HOA was formed, long before the fake Tuscan dreams, and he'd carved out an ironclad exemption in the original deed that stated in black and white ink that no future homeowners association could force him or his successors to join. Karen apparently either didn't know this or didn't care, because not 2 days after I moved in and set up a fire pit made from salvaged bricks, she showed up fuming about the smell of smoke, claimed my lawn gnome violated visual harmony, and told me my mailbox was half an inch too low. I asked her to please leave my property. She told me it was actually her property, too, by community extension. She was the president of the HOA, of course, self-appointed as most HOAs go. Nobody really remembered voting. She had that clipped voice, the kind that turned every sentence into a policy memo. She wore perfume that smelled like lavender and chlorine, and her sunglasses were always perched high like she was expecting a photo shoot. She came by 3 more times that week, each time escalating the drama. First it was the gnome, then the outdoor string lights. Then she sent her cousin, a man named Randy with an official-looking badge that turned out to be from a fantasy cosplay convention, to inspect my fence. I ignored it all, assuming it would die down until the lawsuit came. The envelope was real. So was the court date. Karen, under the HOA's name, was officially suing me for refusal to join the association, claiming damages due to non-compliance with community standards. I laughed again when I read it, mostly because the phrase non-compliant backyard furniture arrangement was used unironically. But when I called the number listed as HOA legal counsel, I got a very confused man named Leo who said he was a tax consultant and hadn't practiced law in 15 years. That's when I realized Karen had cobbled together a Frankenstein's monster of fake authority and small-town drama and was banking on the fact that I'd either roll over or settle. I didn't settle. I opened a file cabinet my Uncle Bob had built into the wall, the one with the triple lock and the burn mark across the top. Inside was a folder labeled HOA over my dead body. It contained not just the original deed, but a full paper trail of legal exemptions, correspondences with the city zoning board, and a notarized letter from the township clerk confirming the land's immunity to annexation under the HOA's jurisdiction. In short, I had receipts, legal ones. I called a friend of mine, Julia, who'd gone into real estate law and owed me a favor. She nearly choked laughing when I sent her the HOA's lawsuit and my counter documents. Karen wasn't done, though. No, she upped the ante. She started holding community emergency meetings, passing around flyers with my face on them that said, "Non-compliant resident, threat to community integrity." She claimed I was hosting illegal bonfires, endangering local wildlife, and encouraging an antisocial lifestyle that threatened collective morale. I caught one of her minions trying to measure my lawn with a measuring tape at midnight. Another tried to document my trash bins on a Sunday to prove they violated aesthetic bin alignment protocol. I wasn't even mad. I was impressed by the level of obsession, but I stayed quiet, collected everything, and waited for the court date because the best revenge in small-town politics is paperwork. I tried talking to her once. I figured maybe she just didn't know the land's history, the exemptions, the clauses. Maybe if I explained it with lemonade on the porch, she'd drop the nonsense. She accepted the lemonade, sipped once, and said, "You're a legal loophole, and I don't like loopholes." Then she smiled, thanked me, and walked away like we'd just finished a bridge game. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about rules. It was about control, and she couldn't stand the fact that I lived in her kingdom without kissing the ring. Things escalated quickly after that. One morning, I woke up to a citation taped to my door. It was printed on official-looking HOA paper, but the watermark was crooked and the signature line read Enforcer-in-Chief. It accused me of willful deviation from shared cultural values and listed a $400 fine. I framed it. A week later, Karen announced to the neighborhood that she'd be pursuing all legal options to remove hostile elements from Fern Hollow. Someone egged my fence. Another neighbor whispered an apology at the grocery store. I just smiled and stocked up on popcorn because I had a date with the county court and I planned to bring every page of Bob's war chest. By the time the court notice arrived, I had compiled 3 binders. One of deeds and exemptions, one of HOA missteps and illegal actions, and one full of screenshots from the HOA Facebook group where Karen had gone on rants that bordered on delusional. The court date was set for a Friday morning. I ironed a shirt. Karen showed up in a pantsuit with a scarf that looked like it cost more than my truck. She was ready for battle. So was I. She didn't know that the land she'd built her HOA empire on had one glaring flaw. Her own house sat partially on land I technically owned through an old platline extension. I hadn't told her yet. I was saving it for the judge. For the moment, she'd stand there wagging her finger and demanding compliance, and I'd hand over a deed so ironclad it could deflect bullets. That moment was coming. I could feel it. But for now, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee next to the raccoon, watching Karen storm back to her car after dropping off another flyer warning residents about the dangers of individualism. I smiled, held up the lawsuit one more time, and said to no one in particular, "This is going to be fun." The day after Karen filed the lawsuit, things in Fern Hollow shifted from mildly absurd to aggressively theatrical, like someone had decided to turn our sleepy lakeside community into a daytime soap opera. I woke up to find a group of neighbors standing across the street, arms crossed, muttering amongst themselves while pretending to inspect the communal hydrangeas. One of them, a retired dentist named Harold, kept glancing at my porch like I was a newly discovered species. It was clear Karen had begun rallying the troops. By mid-morning, I found a glossy flyer jammed into my mailbox announcing a mandatory community standards emergency meeting to be held in Karen's backyard. The flyer was filled with phrases like neighbor unity, moral decay, and property value defense, and it concluded with a stern reminder that non-attendance would be noted. The bottom corner had a small blurry image of my face from what looked like a Facebook profile picture taken 5 years ago. Below it in bright red text were the words "Current Compliance Threat." I stood there for a moment rereading the flyer, coffee going cold in my hand before chuckling and dropping it in the fire pit. Then I went back inside and opened up the files my Uncle Bob had so meticulously compiled. Because while Karen was stirring the neighborhood into a panic, I was planning a very different kind of counterstrike. The first thing I needed was clarity on just how far Karen's delusions stretched. I called Julia, my friend from law school, who now specialized in property and real estate law. She had once helped a man sue a pet psychic for fraud, so I figured she could handle Karen's paper-thin lawsuit. I sent her the scanned documents from Bob's file, including the original deed from the early 1980s, the plat surveys, the municipal exemption letters, and a hand-sketched diagram with the words, "Do not let these clowns annex this land," written in my uncle's familiar block letters. Julia called me back within the hour, already laughing. She told me not only was the HOA's lawsuit shaky, but if I wanted, I could countersue for harassment, misuse of funds, and potentially fraud, depending on how the HOA was operating. That's when I decided to go to the city records office in person and see just how legal this HOA really was. The clerk behind the counter was an older woman named Ruth, who seemed thrilled to have an actual person request physical documents. I explained my situation and she raised an eyebrow before pulling out a set of dusty binders from a back room. It took us an hour, but we found what we were looking for. Documentation of the original subdivision filings, the HOA incorporation paperwork, and a map that hadn't been updated since flip phones were considered futuristic. And just like Julia suspected, there was a glaring hole in the HOA's legal foundation. The original subdivision filings clearly excluded my property. Not only that, but the entire HOA was technically incomplete because several required signatures were never collected during its formation. It was like someone tried to build a house on stilts, but forgot to put down the stilts. Armed with this knowledge, I returned home and began compiling a master binder. I made copies of everything, labeled them meticulously, and even threw in screenshots of Karen's Facebook rants for good measure. Meanwhile, Karen continued her crusade. She went door to door handing out compliance pamphlets filled with vaguely threatening language and plenty of exclamation points. She tried to shame neighbors into choosing sides. She stood at the community mailbox handing out mini muffins to anyone who agreed to sign a petition calling for my immediate removal or forced compliance. One poor teenager who lived 3 doors down and had no idea what an HOA even was came to me later apologizing and returning the muffin uneaten. Karen had cornered him while he was walking his dog and asked if he supported unity or chaos. His dog barked at her, which I took as a good sign. That weekend, I decided to test the waters. I went to Karen's backyard emergency meeting, not to argue, just to observe. I brought a notebook and a lawn chair and sat in the back row. Karen was standing at the front under a canopy, surrounded by a folding table covered in HOA rulebooks, brochures, and a stack of what looked like eviction warning templates. She was wearing a blazer over a floral sundress, and she had a whistle around her neck like she was coaching a soccer team instead of running a neighborhood tribunal. She launched into a dramatic monologue about how the community's values were under attack, how one man's rebellion could unravel years of social harmony, and how the very fabric of Fern Hollow was being threatened by unchecked individualism. People nodded, some looked confused, and one man yawned audibly. When she pointed directly at me and asked if I would publicly commit to the HOA, I simply raised my hand and said, "I own land you don't even know about, Karen, and I'm not committing to anything except bringing popcorn to court." That got a few chuckles. Karen's face tightened into the kind of smile that says, "I will destroy you, but I'll do it with cupcakes and subpoenas." The next morning, I received a typed letter on HOA letterhead slipped under my door. It was labeled Final Warning and claimed that my ongoing insubordination had escalated my status to hostile resident. It ended with a recommendation that I attend mediation or risk further escalation and removal procedures. I added it to the binder. I was almost impressed with how creative she was getting. I decided it was time to bring Julia into the picture directly. I had her draft a formal response to the lawsuit, attach copies of all relevant exemptions, and include a polite but firm notice that any further harassment would result in a countersuit. Julia also flagged something else in her response, a discrepancy in Karen's own property lines. She asked me to check the county map and cross-reference it with Bob's deed. When I did, my jaw hit the floor. Karen's house, the Golden Palace of HOA tyranny, was partially built over a parcel that technically fell within a narrow wedge of land deeded to my uncle in the 1980s. The plat line shifted just enough to include a portion of her backyard and driveway. That meant that if I wanted to, I could put up a fence, plant a tree, or build a chicken coop in her rose garden, and there wouldn't be much she could do about it. I didn't do any of that. Not yet. But I did make a note in my binder. I also highlighted it with 3 different colors and put a tab labeled Emergency Fund. The day before our first court date, I spent the afternoon on my porch with a lawn chair, a cold drink, and the raccoon who I'd started calling Franklin. Karen drove by slowly, glaring at me behind the wheel of her silver SUV. I raised my glass in a cheerful salute. The whole situation had gone from annoying to hilarious to something out of a small-town sitcom. Except the stakes were real, and I had no intention of losing. The morning of the court date arrived with a strange calm, the kind of silence that comes before a storm that only one person knows is about to hit. I woke up early, dressed in the most nonchalantly formal way possible, and loaded my 3 binders of legal ammunition into a canvas tote bag. Karen had chosen to represent the HOA herself, no doubt imagining some triumphant courtroom monologue that ended with gasps and applause. I half expected her to arrive on horseback waving a gavel like a sword. Instead, when I pulled into the courthouse parking lot, she was already there, standing next to her car in a full navy pantsuit and red heels that were more suited for a city council photo op than a local land dispute. She was flanked by two neighbors, Harold, the retired dentist, and a woman named Lacey, who once left a passive-aggressive note on my windshield because my truck was dusty. They were all smiles when I walked past Karen, holding a slim leather folder that screamed overconfidence and under-preparation. I gave her a polite nod, stepped inside and tried not to chuckle when I saw the judge assigned to our case. Judge Mendelsohn, a wiry, sharp-eyed man with a permanent smirk etched into his features, had a reputation for eviscerating people who came to court with nonsense. I suddenly felt like I was holding a royal flush while Karen was bluffing with Uno cards. We were called in 10 minutes later. The courtroom was modest with polished wooden benches and a podium that wobbled slightly when touched. Karen made a dramatic entrance, walking to the plaintiff's table like she was accepting an award while I quietly took my seat and opened my binder. The judge glanced at the file in front of him, squinted at Karen, then raised an eyebrow at me. "You the defendant?" he asked. I nodded. He looked at Karen and said, "All right, let's hear this." Karen rose like she'd been practicing the speech in front of her bathroom mirror for a week. She started with an impassioned tirade about community standards, the sanctity of shared values, and the threat I posed to neighborhood cohesion. She spoke of lawn gnomes, fire pits, non-compliant trash bin placement, and the dangers of mailboxes that didn't meet the agreed-upon aesthetic specifications. At one point, she held up a photograph of my raccoon, Franklin, as evidence of environmental instability. The judge stared at her for a long moment before asking, "And your legal basis for compelling the defendant to join your HOA?" Karen, undeterred, began reading from what she claimed was the original HOA charter, citing bylaws and amendments with dramatic flair. But when the judge asked for a copy, she hesitated, then handed him a packet of papers that looked suspiciously like a Word document printed the night before. Judge Mendelsohn flipped through them, his smirk growing, then turned to me. "Sir, do you have a response?" I stood, walked calmly to the bench, and handed him my binder. I'd labeled it Exhibit A, Legal Ownership and Exemption Documentation. He opened it, scanned the first few pages, then let out a short laugh. He flipped to the plat maps, the notarized letter from the zoning board, the city clerk's signed statement confirming my exemption from the HOA, and then to the highlighted section showing that Karen's own home was partially on my land. He looked up at Karen, who was now visibly pale, and said, "You suit someone who doesn't legally fall under your jurisdiction, who never signed a contract with your organization, and who appears to own part of the land your own house sits on." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I added, "Your Honor, I've never agreed to be part of the HOA. My property is explicitly exempt in all relevant documentation. And I've been harassed, threatened with fines, and slandered in community flyers for refusing to bend to a non-binding association. Also, I believe the HOA has been collecting dues from several homes that aren't officially within the HOA boundary. I have those names and lot numbers in this second binder." The judge raised his hand, stopping me mid-sentence, and leaned back in his chair. He turned to Karen and said, "Ma'am, this court is not in the habit of entertaining imaginary authority. Your case has no merit, and frankly, it's bordering on abuse of process." Then he looked at me again, nodded approvingly, and asked if I wanted to file a counterclaim. I told him, not yet. I just wanted peace for now. The ruling was swift. Case dismissed. HOA has no legal authority over the defendant. Further attempts to compel or fine him would constitute harassment. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. Her cheeks twitched and her hands trembled as she gathered her folder. Outside the courtroom, she didn't speak a word. Her allies didn't either. They just followed her to the parking lot like loyal but confused soldiers after losing a battle their leader swore was already won. I sat in my truck for a moment, letting the quiet satisfaction settle in. Franklin would be getting extra marshmallows tonight. But things didn't end there. Karen had taken a public loss, and in communities like Fern Hollow, public defeat meant social collapse. Within days, whispers began to spread. People who had once nodded along to her every suggestion were now backing away, murmuring about due process and overreach. Someone anonymously mailed me a batch of cookies with a note that read, "Sorry about all the lawn gnome stuff. You were right." I got a call from a neighbor named Marcus who confessed that Karen had been inflating HOA dues for years, using the extra funds for things like her monthly spa trips and elaborate flower arrangements for the clubhouse that technically didn't belong to her. He said she'd convinced the board to sign off on expenditures by citing vague morale-boosting initiatives. The final blow came when I was invited to a neighborhood bonfire. Yes, the same activity Karen had once tried to ban. It was held in the community green space and more than 30 people showed up. No HOA forms, no compliance checks, just neighbors talking, laughing, and collectively acknowledging the absurdity of the last few months. Karen didn't come. Her house was dark. Someone mentioned that she'd been on the phone with a realtor. Another whispered that the city might be reviewing the HOA's entire legitimacy now that the court documents had been filed. I didn't ask questions. I just enjoyed the fire, the company, and the quiet understanding that no one was going to knock on my door with a tape measure and a passive-aggressive citation again. That night, I opened the third binder, the one labeled HOA misconduct evidence, and began organizing it. I wasn't planning to use it, but I wanted it ready just in case. Because even though the judge had laughed and the lawsuit had crumbled and Karen's little empire had started to fall apart, I knew one thing for certain. People like her don't give up control easily. They regroup. They reframe. They try to rebuild their little fiefdoms with new rules and different titles. But this time, the neighborhood had seen what happens when someone pushes too far. And I had a deed that said, no one, no matter how many muffins they hand out or flyers they print, could force me to kneel to a paper crown. Not on my land, not ever. The week following the courtroom humiliation should have been the end of it. The final nail in the coffin of Karen's crusade, but instead it turned out to be the prologue to a new, even stranger chapter. The kind where pride, paranoia, and performative authority mixed into a toxic stew, and Karen predictably refused to go down quietly. Rather than retreat with whatever grace she could salvage, she doubled down, ramping up her efforts to reassert control over the neighborhood, as though the court ruling had merely been a temporary setback. The first sign came when a man in a reflective vest with a clipboard and sunglasses knocked on my door and introduced himself as a code enforcement liaison on behalf of the Fern Hollow Homeowners Preservation Committee. The title alone made me pause. I asked him what department he worked for. He said he was a freelance compliance consultant, which I correctly interpreted to mean Karen had hired someone off Craigslist who owned a printer and a pair of boots. He handed me a notice of violation for what he called unauthorized lawn furnishings and began walking around my property taking photos with a flip phone. I calmly walked behind him, asking politely which municipal statute he believed I had violated. He replied that it wasn't a statute. It was a community principle and principles didn't require codes, just conviction. I reminded him he was on private property and had 10 seconds to leave before Franklin, who was currently peering out from under the porch, decided to give him a surprise nibble. The man left quickly, tripping over a decorative rock on his way out. 2 days later, a new sign appeared at the entrance to the neighborhood. It was freshly installed, made of cheap aluminum, and read, "Welcome to Fern Hollow, a community of shared vision." Below it, in smaller font, it read managed by the FHHPC committee. There was no mention of the HOA, no legal name, just an abstract phrase designed to sound vaguely official. Karen had created a rebranded version of her old kingdom, this time without the burden of legal accountability. She'd started a Facebook group for it, too, filled with motivational quotes about order and community spirit, plus carefully curated images of manicured lawns and symmetrically arranged flower beds. Her allies, what few remained, began using new titles. Lacey was now the vision director. Harold had been dubbed the compliance whisperer. I almost admired the absurdity of it. But when I discovered a fresh flyer taped to my truck window accusing me of encouraging disorderly aesthetics and warning of impending community degradation, I realized Karen wasn't done playing games. She just changed the board and renamed the pieces. I wasn't the only one noticing. A few neighbors approached me with nervous smiles, some apologizing for their silence during the lawsuit. One man, Jeff, confessed that Karen had been quietly pressuring families to donate to her community betterment fund, which was being used to finance things like security vests, branded clipboards, and professionally printed courtesy warnings. I asked if anyone had actually voted for this new committee. He shrugged and said there was a barbecue last Saturday, and Karen had passed around a sign-in sheet labeled Community Support Agreement. Most people thought it was just a guest list. I asked him to send me a photo. He did. It was clear Karen was trying to manufacture legitimacy through optics and word games, counting casual signatures as some sort of binding commitment. I printed out the screenshot and added it to my increasingly thick new binder, now labeled committee nonsense and other circus acts. Then came the real escalation. I woke up one morning to find 2 local news vans parked outside the neighborhood entrance. A reporter from Channel 9, a woman named Becca with a sharp voice and an even sharper bob haircut, was doing a piece on rising tensions in Fern Hollow. Someone had tipped them off anonymously. My guess was Karen, hoping to stage a redemption arc or rally more support, but the story she tried to pitch quickly spiraled out of her hand. Becca came to my door first, asking if I was willing to speak on camera about the recent HOA lawsuit and the new committee's activities. I told her I'd be happy to, but only if she took a look at some of the documents I had. We sat on my porch while I walked her through the original land deed, the court ruling, the flyers, the fake enforcer, and the suspicious financial transactions tied to the so-called Betterment Fund. Halfway through, she stopped taking notes and asked, "Does she actually live on your land?" I smiled and pointed to the highlighted plat map. A portion of her backyard, about 10 feet of it, fell squarely within the bounds of my lot. Becca's eyes lit up. She thanked me, packed up, and marched over to Karen's house with her camera crew in tow. What followed was television gold. Karen stepped out of her house dressed like she was attending a ribbon-cutting ceremony. She began her usual speech about unity and shared values, ignoring the pointed questions about legal standing and unauthorized fundraising. When Becca asked whether she was aware that her property partially overlapped with land she didn't own, Karen's smile faltered. She deflected, insisting the plat lines were outdated and likely misprinted. When the reporter asked if she'd seen the recent court ruling, Karen claimed she was still reviewing it with her internal legal team, which likely meant Harold and a stack of real estate brochures. The news segment aired that night, and to no one's surprise, it didn't exactly paint Karen in a flattering light. The headline read, "Local HOA President Loses Lawsuit, Creates New Vision Committee," and featured a split screen of me feeding Franklin and Karen holding a brochure that said, "Excellence begins with uniformity." It was a hit. The fallout came fast. A group of residents tired of the ongoing drama began organizing their own informal coalition, not to enforce rules, but to actively resist them. They called it Fern Hollow Free, a tongue-in-cheek name that started as a joke but gained traction fast. Lawn gnomes began popping up everywhere. One neighbor painted his shed bright purple and named it the Liberty Shack. Kids started selling t-shirts that said, "I'm with the deed guy." Someone even made Franklin a tiny crown. I didn't ask who. It was glorious. Karen, of course, tried to retaliate. She launched a new round of flyers claiming the news piece was manipulated and that I had doctored documents to mislead the community. She even posted a bizarre video on the community Facebook page where she stood in front of her rose bushes and read a poem about order and vision while wind chimes clanged violently in the background. Comments were disabled within an hour. Then she sent another fake citation. This one accusing me of aggressive landscaping. I added it to the binder and went back to watering my grass. Because at this point, the more she flailed, the more obvious it became that her grip was slipping. What truly buried her came not from me, but from the city itself. Someone at the zoning office, probably amused by the news coverage, began looking into the legality of Karen's committee and its recent signage, activities, and fund collection. Within a week, she received an official notice demanding immediate clarification of her organization's legal status along with a warning against soliciting donations under false pretenses. If anyone thought Karen would quietly slip away after her committee collapsed, and the news segment lit a bonfire under her credibility, they clearly didn't understand the mechanics of a woman who thrived not on truth or legality, but on spectacle and control. The signs might have disappeared and the clipboards gone silent, but her pride was still bruised and festering. And instead of retreating into the background, she began rebuilding in the shadows, crafting something sneakier, more manipulative, and infinitely more theatrical. It started with the neighborhood children. Oddly enough, kids who used to run through the cul-de-sac with water guns and skateboards suddenly came home with branded flyers in their pockets and tote bags filled with granola bars and pens that said, "Vision Reimagined." Parents thought it was a school initiative until one of them noticed a stamp on the bottom corner of a brochure, Property Stewardship Club sponsored by the FHHPC Heritage Extension. I nearly spit out my drink when I read that. Karen hadn't just tried to rebrand her committee again. She had turned it into a youth outreach program, a shadow HOA disguised as a mentoring initiative. The woman was relentless. Soon enough, people began receiving calls from a number that showed up as Fern Hollow Community Wellness. The voice on the other end, soft, rehearsed, vaguely robotic, asked if the resident would like to attend a new wellness circle, a non-judgmental space to discuss ways to improve the neighborhood's emotional climate. Karen had replaced bylaws with buzzwords. Now, it wasn't about rule enforcement. It was about healing spaces, shared narratives, and responsible ownership. I attended one of the first sessions out of pure curiosity, dressed in my oldest flannel shirt, and accompanied by Franklin in a harness just to make a point. The meeting was held in Karen's backyard again, this time with teal-colored cushions arranged in a circle, incense burning from an overpriced ceramic frog, and Karen herself seated at the head of the circle wearing all white like she was preparing to levitate. She opened the session by asking each person to state their name and one thing in the neighborhood that made them feel unstable. I said, my neighbor's unlicensed spiritual HOA and its vaguely cult-like recruitment efforts, that earned a nervous chuckle from the group. Karen smiled with the kind of calm that masks a roiling storm beneath, thanked me for my courage, and then moved on as if I hadn't just torn open the curtain on her latest performance. Still, not everyone saw it that way. Some of the newer residents, those who hadn't been around for the lawsuit or the news piece, were genuinely drawn in by the aura of community care. Karen had learned from her defeat. This time, she wasn't threatening anyone with fines or rules. She was offering tea, soft music, and promises of neighborhood harmony. But under all that softness, the control was still there. After one meeting, a neighbor told me Karen had gently suggested they repaint their shutters to better reflect a peaceful tone. Another said she was asked to move her garden gnome because it disrupted the emotional flow of the block. Karen was weaponizing kindness, using emotional language as camouflage for the same tired agenda. I began documenting all of it, not because I feared another lawsuit, she wouldn't be foolish enough to go down that road again, but because I had a feeling her next attempt would involve something even bigger. And I was right. The next maneuver came in the form of an email sent to every resident of Fern Hollow. It was titled Community Stewardship Proposal and attached was a 10-page document outlining a new neighborhood initiative that proposed a soft charter, a voluntary agreement meant to restore dignity to the shared space we all call home. It read like a cross between a yoga retreat pamphlet and a zoning code. The agreement wasn't legally binding, Karen assured everyone, but it represented a moral compass by which residents could gently guide one another. I skimmed through it and laughed out loud. Hidden among the poetic phrases and quotes from Thoreau were thinly veiled restrictions on everything from garden ornament placement to visual noise levels. It even suggested the formation of microcircles, neighborhood pods that would meet bi-weekly to assess each home's vibrational harmony. I highlighted all the passive-aggressive nonsense and sent it straight to Julia, who replied with a simple sentence. This is more dangerous than her last attempt because it sounds so nice. And she was right. Karen had learned the language of manipulation. This wasn't about barking orders anymore. It was about convincing people to leash themselves. I decided it was time for a counter-move. If Karen could repackage tyranny in a tea-scented wrapper, I could expose it with humor and clarity. So, I made a pamphlet of my own. It was called the Fern Hollow Freedom Packet. And inside were scanned copies of the original plat lines, my court ruling, a brief legal explanation about what a binding HOA actually entails, and a page titled Spot the Manipulation featuring quotes from Karen's proposal side by side with commentary in plain English. I left a stack at the community center, another at the coffee shop, and a few at the clubhouse bulletin board, knowing full well Karen would find them. I also started giving out stickers that said HOA free since 1983 and put one on Franklin's little harness for added effect. Within days, people began reaching out. Some sent emails thanking me for clarifying the legal situation. Others shared stories of how they felt subtly pressured to conform to Karen's suggestions. A few even admitted they had been afraid to speak up. One neighbor, a quiet woman named Ellen, who lived 2 doors down, told me Karen had once described her front yard as spiritually jagged and suggested she plant lavender to soothe the block's aura. Ellen had been too embarrassed to refuse. And just like that, the community began to tilt, not in loud rebellion, but in quiet resistance. A man painted a mural on his garage. A teenager built a neon pink birdhouse and installed it on the community path. Someone organized a block party with a bouncy castle and music that definitely didn't meet Karen's serenity guidelines. The illusion of control, once so thick you could choke on it, began to thin and crack. Karen didn't disappear, but she became increasingly isolated, wandering through the streets with a forced smile, carrying pamphlets that no one took. Her final act of desperation came in the form of a letter slipped into every mailbox, typed in Comic Sans and ending with the words, "May harmony prevail." It was equal parts plea, sermon, and veiled threat. I read it, sighed, and slid it into the ever-growing folder marked Karen's paper trail of delusion. Then, without warning, Karen vanished. Her car was gone. Her house lights off. For 4 days there was no sign of her. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she'd moved to a retirement village. Others swore she'd been hired by a new development downstate to lead their HOA. I didn't know what to believe. Then one morning, a moving truck pulled into her driveway. A young couple stepped out, smiling, holding hands, clearly relieved to be starting fresh in a quiet neighborhood. I introduced myself, welcomed them, and casually asked what they'd been told about the place. The strange thing about peace is that when you finally get it, your brain doesn't know what to do with the silence. After months of chaos, lawsuits, backyard tribunals, staged community therapy circles, and passive-aggressive flyers, Fern Hollow had finally settled into something resembling sanity. The sun still rose over the same hills. The same birds chirped in the morning, and the same raccoon named Franklin continued his tyrannical rule over the porch. But there was a softness in the air now, a sense that the neighborhood had collectively exhaled. Karen was gone, her house sold, her influence vaporized like fog burned away by a strong sun. The young couple who moved in were friendly and refreshingly unbothered by landscaping politics. They painted their mailbox neon green just for fun, and nobody said a word. If anything, it became a conversation starter, a symbol that the spell had been broken and that freedom had quite literally been mailed in. I spent those first few quiet weeks repairing the small damages that all the HOA drama had caused, replacing a few broken fence posts, replanting some trampled shrubs, and finally repainting my porch swing without worrying about anyone citing me for disruptive color palettes. The raccoon supervised, of course, lounging like a tired king, enjoying the post-war restoration of his kingdom. People dropped by more often now, not with complaints or hidden agendas, but with actual muffins, coffee, or just a wave as they passed. A neighbor named Chris, who had once refused to make eye contact for fear of being seen associating with the HOA's public enemy number one, now came by twice a week just to talk about football and share garden tips. The tension that had turned our street into a minefield was gone, replaced by a cautious but genuine sense of community. It was odd really how easily people slipped back into being normal once the pressure to perform for a committee had lifted. But even as I enjoyed the calm, I couldn't fully let my guard down. The whole ordeal had taught me how quickly one person's hunger for control could spread like wildfire if left unchecked. So, while I wasn't watching over my shoulder, I was keeping an eye on the edges. New flyers, strange meetings, or the return of anything with the words vision, stewardship, or harmony printed in pastel colors. I'd gotten too good at spotting tyranny wrapped in a smile to ever be caught off guard again. Still, for a while, there was nothing to worry about. Even the city, perhaps embarrassed by how long it had taken them to intervene, sent a formal letter confirming that Fern Hollow's HOA had been formally dissolved due to lack of legal integrity, insufficient documentation, and demonstrated community opposition. I had it framed, hung it right next to the citation Karen once gave me for an unauthorized wind chime. Then came the surprise invitation. It arrived in a sleek white envelope with a gold foil seal, looking so official I almost mistook it for a tax audit. Inside was a letter from the City Planning Board inviting me to attend a special advisory meeting on residential zoning reform. Apparently, someone at City Hall had read about the HOA fiasco and decided I had something valuable to contribute. At first, I thought it was a joke, some elaborate prank by the guy down the road who once put googly eyes on everyone's recycling bins. But the contact number was real. And the person who answered was entirely too professional to be messing around. They wanted to hear about my experience, not just the lawsuit, but how the community rebuilt after the collapse of centralized control. I wasn't exactly thrilled about attending a government meeting, but I figured if my story could help prevent another Karen from rising up in a different neighborhood, it was worth the trip. So, I went. I wore the same suit I'd worn at court, the same one that had survived Karen's final stand, and brought my original binder, now updated with a few additional tabs, and a thumb drive full of scanned documents, photos, and receipts from everything that had unfolded over the past year. The meeting was held in a modest conference room downtown, filled with city officials, legal advisors, and a few community representatives. I expected to be asked a few questions and dismissed, but instead I was given the floor. I told them everything. How the HOA had overstepped, how Karen had used soft power when hard power failed, how people had been manipulated into silence, and how the eventual unraveling had only happened because someone had been stubborn enough to say no early on. I didn't dramatize it, didn't turn it into a spectacle. I just laid out the facts and let the absurdity speak for itself. When I finished, a long pause followed. Then a woman from the zoning board nodded and said, "We've seen a dozen versions of your story this year, but never with such a clean ending. What you did matters." Then she asked if I'd be willing to consult on a pilot program to help other communities avoid similar implosions. I didn't give an answer right away. I had to think about it, but the offer lingered in my mind like a song you hear once and can't forget. Back home, Fern Hollow continued its quiet evolution. The block party committee had gone from a formality run by the HOA to an actual group of neighbors who met once a month in someone's garage. They planned events, not mandates. Instead of compliance patrols, people volunteered for gardening days. It wasn't perfect. There were still squabbles over noise or property lines now and then, but the difference was that nobody assumed they had the authority to dictate behavior. Conversations replaced citations. Humor replaced fear. I saw kids playing soccer in the cul-de-sac without being told their shoes were scuffing the community's energy. Someone painted a bench with a mural of ducks wearing sunglasses. No one tore it down. In a strange twist of fate, Karen's obsession with forced unity had left behind an actual unity. But it came only after she was gone, only after her grip had been broken and people remembered what it was like to just live. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast long shadows over the street, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't typed, had no logo or formatting, just a folded piece of paper with my name scrawled on the front. Inside was a brief handwritten note. It read, "I fought for order and I lost." Maybe it was the wrong kind of order. I read it, sighed, and slid it into the ever-growing folder marked Karen's paper trail of delusion. Then, without warning, Karen vanished. Her car was gone. Her house lights off. For 4 days there was no sign of her. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she'd moved to a retirement village. Others swore she'd been hired by a new development downstate to lead their HOA. I didn't know what to believe. Then one morning, a moving truck pulled into her driveway. A young couple stepped out, smiling, holding hands, clearly relieved to be starting fresh in a quiet neighborhood. I introduced myself, welcomed them, and casually asked what they'd been told about the place. The strange thing about peace is that when you finally get it, your brain doesn't know what to do with the silence. After months of chaos, lawsuits, backyard tribunals, staged community therapy circles, and passive-aggressive flyers, Fern Hollow had finally settled into something resembling sanity. The sun still rose over the same hills. The same birds chirped in the morning, and the same raccoon named Franklin continued his tyrannical rule over the porch. But there was a softness in the air now, a sense that the neighborhood had collectively exhaled. Karen was gone, her house sold, her influence vaporized like fog burned away by a strong sun. The young couple who moved in were friendly and refreshingly unbothered by landscaping politics. They painted their mailbox neon green just for fun, and nobody said a word. If anything, it became a conversation starter, a symbol that the spell had been broken and that freedom had quite literally been mailed in. I spent those first few quiet weeks repairing the small damages that all the HOA drama had caused, replacing a few broken fence posts, replanting some trampled shrubs, and finally repainting my porch swing without worrying about anyone citing me for disruptive color palettes. The raccoon supervised, of course, lounging like a tired king, enjoying the post-war restoration of his kingdom. People dropped by more often now, not with complaints or hidden agendas, but with actual muffins, coffee, or just a wave as they passed. A neighbor named Chris, who had once refused to make eye contact for fear of being seen associating with the HOA's public enemy number one, now came by twice a week just to talk about football and share garden tips. The tension that had turned our street into a minefield was gone, replaced by a cautious but genuine sense of community. It was odd really how easily people slipped back into being normal once the pressure to perform for a committee had lifted. But even as I enjoyed the calm, I couldn't fully let my guard down. The whole ordeal had taught me how quickly one person's hunger for control could spread like wildfire if left unchecked. So, while I wasn't watching over my shoulder, I was keeping an eye on the edges. New flyers, strange meetings, or the return of anything with the words vision, stewardship, or harmony printed in pastel colors. I'd gotten too good at spotting tyranny wrapped in a smile to ever be caught off guard again. Still, for a while, there was nothing to worry about. Even the city, perhaps embarrassed by how long it had taken them to intervene, sent a formal letter confirming that Fern Hollow's HOA had been formally dissolved due to lack of legal integrity, insufficient documentation, and demonstrated community opposition. I had it framed, hung it right next to the citation Karen once gave me for an unauthorized wind chime. Then came the surprise invitation. It arrived in a sleek white envelope with a gold foil seal, looking so official I almost mistook it for a tax audit. Inside was a letter from the City Planning Board inviting me to attend a special advisory meeting on residential zoning reform. Apparently, someone at City Hall had read about the HOA fiasco and decided I had something valuable to contribute. At first, I thought it was a joke, some elaborate prank by the guy down the road who once put googly eyes on everyone's recycling bins. But the contact number was real. And the person who answered was entirely too professional to be messing around. They wanted to hear about my experience, not just the lawsuit, but how the community rebuilt after the collapse of centralized control. I wasn't exactly thrilled about attending a government meeting, but I figured if my story could help prevent another Karen from rising up in a different neighborhood, it was worth the trip. So, I went. I wore the same suit I'd worn at court, the same one that had survived Karen's final stand, and brought my original binder, now updated with a few additional tabs, and a thumb drive full of scanned documents, photos, and receipts from everything that had unfolded over the past year. The meeting was held in a modest conference room downtown, filled with city officials, legal advisors, and a few community representatives. I expected to be asked a few questions and dismissed, but instead I was given the floor. I told them everything. How the HOA had overstepped, how Karen had used soft power when hard power failed, how people had been manipulated into silence, and how the eventual unraveling had only happened because someone had been stubborn enough to say no early on. I didn't dramatize it, didn't turn it into a spectacle. I just laid out the facts and let the absurdity speak for itself. When I finished, a long pause followed. Then a woman from the zoning board nodded and said, "We've seen a dozen versions of your story this year, but never with such a clean ending. What you did matters." Then she asked if I'd be willing to consult on a pilot program to help other communities avoid similar implosions. I didn't give an answer right away. I had to think about it, but the offer lingered in my mind like a song you hear once and can't forget. Back home, Fern Hollow continued its quiet evolution. The block party committee had gone from a formality run by the HOA to an actual group of neighbors who met once a month in someone's garage. They planned events, not mandates. Instead of compliance patrols, people volunteered for gardening days. It wasn't perfect. There were still squabbles over noise or property lines now and then, but the difference was that nobody assumed they had the authority to dictate behavior. Conversations replaced citations. Humor replaced fear. I saw kids playing soccer in the cul-de-sac without being told their shoes were scuffing the community's energy. Someone painted a bench with a mural of ducks wearing sunglasses. No one tore it down. In a strange twist of fate, Karen's obsession with forced unity had left behind an actual unity. But it came only after she was gone, only after her grip had been broken and people remembered what it was like to just live. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast long shadows over the street, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't typed, had no logo or formatting, just a folded piece of paper with my name scrawled on the front. Inside was a brief handwritten note. It read, "I fought for order and I lost." Maybe it was the wrong kind of order. But it wasn't. The note was brief. It said I was wrong. I see that now. I thought I was protecting something precious, but it turns out I was just scared of losing control. I made a mess and you cleaned it up without becoming like me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you'll accept the apology. Signed with regret, Karen. That was it. No grand justification, no backhanded self-defense, just a quiet surrender on paper. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to crumple it up and let the wind take it. Another part of me wanted to frame it next to the court ruling. In the end, I tucked it into the back of the binder where I'd kept all the old HOA documents, the final page in a ridiculous, frustrating, unexpectedly enlightening chapter of my life. That evening, I walked down to the edge of my property, where the old split-rail fence marked the beginning of the land Karen had once insisted belonged to her jurisdiction. I stood there a while, listening to the wind through the trees, watching a hawk glide lazily across the sky. Then I turned and walked back to the porch where Franklin was waiting, half asleep in a patch of sun. I sat beside him, the swing creaking gently beneath us, and let myself feel the quiet. Not the uneasy kind that comes before a new storm, but the full-bodied kind that settles in your chest like a weight you finally get to put down. And as the sun dipped below the hills, casting gold and purple shadows across the neighborhood, I smiled. Not because I had won, not because she had lost, but because everyone else had remembered how to live without needing to control how everyone else lived. Later that week, the city sent another letter. This one not asking for advice, but offering thanks. Apparently, the story of Fern Hollow had made its rounds in zoning committees and neighborhood boards across the state. I had become, to my slight horror and moderate amusement, a kind of folk hero in anti-HOA circles. There were whispers of a community planning award, and someone had even submitted my name to speak at a conference. I declined the invitation, but sent them a copy of my homemade field guide, raccoon anecdotes included. I figured if the world needed a laugh while learning how not to run a neighborhood like a medieval thief, who was I to stop it? On the first day of fall, I hosted a small gathering. Nothing fancy, just lawn chairs, a grill, a few neighbors, and Franklin wandering around begging for scraps like the furry dictator he'd always been. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought a bottle of homemade wine, and we sat under the stars telling stories. No one mentioned rules or violations or community standards. No one asked permission to put up string lights or questioned whether the music was too loud. We were just people together. No king, no council, no Karen. And as the fire crackled and someone passed me a second helping of grilled corn, I looked around and realized this was what neighborhoods were meant to be. Not pristine, not perfect, but honest, a little messy, and full of life.